There is a stretch of Canada so vast that it swallows the imagination whole. The north of Ontario covers more than 800,000 square kilometers, larger than France, Belgium, and the Netherlands combined, and yet fewer than 800,000 people live scattered across the entire thing. In some of its districts you can drive for 4 hours and pass nothing but black spruce, cracked asphalt, and the rusting skeleton of a grain elevator leaning into the wind. Towns that once held thousands have hollowed out to a few dozen souls. The houses left behind sell for less than a used pickup truck, some for as little as $9,500. Why does nobody want them? Hit subscribe. I promise this is worth your time. To understand why the north of this province emptied, you have to understand why anyone came here in the first place. Because nobody arrives in a place this cold and this remote by accident. They came for what was under the ground and what was standing on top of it. Silver, first, then gold, then nickel, copper, uranium, iron, and the endless dark forests of spruce and pine that fed the pulp mills and the sawmills of a growing country. The Canadian Shield, that ancient plateau of scraped rock and cold lakes, turned out to hold some of the richest mineral deposits on the planet. When silver was discovered near Cobalt in 1903, prospectors poured north by the trainload. The Temiskaming and Northern Ontario Railway, built to carry settlers to farmland, suddenly found itself carrying men with picks and dreams instead. Within a few short years, the discoveries multiplied. Gold at Kirkland Lake, gold at Timmins, nickel at Sudbury on a scale the world had never seen. Each strike birthed a town, and each town believed it would last forever. The minerals were only the latest chapter, of course. Long before the mining companies arrived, the first Europeans to push into this country came for fur. The Hudson's Bay Company and its rivals built trading posts along the great rivers that drained toward James Bay and Hudson Bay, and for 2 centuries, the economy of the North ran on beaver pelts carried by canoe and by voyageur along water routes that no road has ever replaced. Those posts drew the first permanent non-indigenous settlements, and around a few of them small communities took root. When the fur trade declined, the posts closed or shrank to a store and a memory. After the fur came the timber. The boreal forest, an ocean of spruce, pine, and poplar, stretching farther than any eye could follow, fed a booming appetite for lumber, and later, for pulp and paper. Sawmills rose on the fast rivers, and mill towns rose around the sawmills, and for a time, the paper made from northern trees printed the newspapers of the world. And binding all of it together was the railway. The lines were pushed north at enormous cost to reach the farmland, the timber, and the ore, and where the railway laid a siding, a town appeared beside it as if summoned. Where the railway later chose a different route, or abandoned a branch line, the town it had summoned withered just as quickly. The fur, the forests, the ore, and the rails between them wrote the entire human geography of the North, and every one of those industries has, in its own time, contracted, automated, or moved on. The pattern repeated itself for the better part of a century. A company would sink a shaft into the rock, and a settlement would rise around it almost overnight. Houses, a school, a church, a hockey rink, a general store, sometimes a single street of tidy wooden homes painted against the gray. The men worked underground, and the families built lives on the surface. For a while the arrangement worked. Wages were decent, the ore was plentiful, and the isolation felt like a small price to pay for a steady paycheck and a house of your own. Children were born in these towns and grew up believing the mine was as permanent as the rock it dug into. Nobody stopped to ask the obvious question, the one that hangs over every resource town ever built. What happens when the reason for the town runs out? What happens when the ore is gone, or the world stops buying it, or a machine can do in an hour what 40 men used to do in a week? The answer came in waves, and each wave carried a few more families south. The first great blow was mechanization. A mine that once employed 2,000 men could, within a single generation, be run by 200. The machines did not need houses or schools or grocery stores, and the families that had filled those things began to drift away one by one. The second blow was depletion, the simplest and most inescapable of them all. Ore bodies are finite. When the richest veins were exhausted, the companies closed the shafts, sealed the headframes, and moved their capital to the next promising patch of rock, leaving the town to survive on nothing but memory and a shrinking tax base. The third blow was global. Prices for nickel, for copper, for pulp and lumber rose and fell on markets decided in London and New York and Shanghai, and a single downturn could gut a community that had been prospering the year before. The fourth blow was policy, as governments phased out certain industries, canceled the contracts that had kept whole regions employed, and quietly redrew the map of where a Canadian was expected to live. Where did the people go? South, almost all of them. To Toronto, to Ottawa, to the swelling suburbs where the offices and the factories and the universities had migrated. The young left first, as the young always do, chasing an education and a career, and a life that did not rise and fall with a commodity price set on the other side of the world. Their parents stayed behind and grew old in the houses they had built, and when the parents died there was often nobody left to inherit, or the children who inherited lived 1,000 kilometers away and had no use for a cold house in a shrinking town. The house sat empty. A realtor's sign faded in the yard through 3 summers of nobody calling. This is the quiet arithmetic of depopulation, and it is worth understanding clearly, because it is not a dramatic exodus with trucks fleeing a disaster. It is a slow bleed, one funeral and one moving van at a time, until a place that once rang with the noise of children is left to a handful of retirees, a boarded church, and the wind coming down an empty main street. Let me take you through the emptiest corners of this province, region by region, and show you exactly what the slow bleed leaves behind when it is finished. Number 1. The James Bay lowlands and the far northern coast. Picture the top third of the provincial map, the enormous wedge of land that stretches from the last paved road all the way to the salt water of James Bay and Hudson Bay. This is one of the most sparsely inhabited places on the entire North American continent. The landscape is muskeg, an endless waterlogged plain of peat bog, stunted tamarack, and a gray sky that seems to press down on the land like a lid. There are no highways here worth the name. The town of Moosonee, near the coast, cannot be reached by car at all in the ordinary sense. You take a train, the Polar Bear Express, 5 hours north from the town of Cochrane, across trestle bridges and through featureless bog, to a community sitting 19 kilometers from the shore of James Bay. Beyond it lie more than 30 First Nations communities that have no year-round road connection whatsoever. They are supplied by aircraft for most of the year, and by winter roads carved across frozen rivers and lakes for a few precious weeks, when the ice grows thick enough to bear a loaded truck. The ice must reach more than a meter in thickness before heavy vehicles can cross, and crews flood the surface layer by layer to build it up. As the winters warm and shorten, those windows are closing, and the cost of flying in diesel, groceries, and building materials climbs every year. There is more remote, fly-in Indigenous territory in this province than in any other region of Canada. Housing in these communities tends to be scarce and badly overcrowded, rather than cheap, which is a genuine crisis of its own. But along the rail line and the coastal outposts you will find dwellings that sit half-empty and change hands for almost nothing. A rough cabin here might list for $11,000 and wait years for a buyer, because that buyer would have to accept a life with no road out, no hospital, and no hardware store closer than a bushplane flight away. To reach even the settled edge of this country, you drive for hours on a 2-lane road where the trees close in on both sides like walls, and the only traffic is the occasional logging truck and the ravens picking at something in the ditch. The gas stations are 100 kilometers apart, and a good many of them have shut, their pumps bagged over, their windows papered with faded notices. In the small outposts, the church stands with its paint peeling. The school gymnasium is used for a bingo night that draws 20 people, and the graveyard is better tended than the main street. Everything a family might need beyond the very basics lies at the far end of a long and lonely drive, or a flight, and everything shipped in arrives with a freight charge attached that would make a southerner wince. The silence in this country is not peaceful. It is the silence of a place the modern world decided it could not afford to reach. A silence broken only by the wind, the water, and the drone of a distant float plane fading into the gray. Number 2. The Elliott Lake Corridor and the North Shore of Lake Superior. Drive the Trans-Canada Highway along the top of the greatest of the Great Lakes, and the scenery will stagger you, cliffs of pink granite plunging straight into cold blue water, spruce clinging to the rock, and for long stretches almost no sign that a human being has ever lived here. Elliott Lake itself is a story that ought to be taught in every school in the country. In the 1950s, it was christened the uranium capital of the world. 10 mines opened across the surrounding district, and at the peak of production, the area was pulling nearly $500 million of uranium out of the rock in a single year, feeding the atomic weapons programs of the Cold War. The town was planned from scratch, a model community carved out of the raw bush, with schools and shopping and neat streets, and its population swelled toward 28,000 people who believed they had found a permanent home. In 1959, word arrived from Washington that the United States would purchase no more uranium for its stockpile. The effect was immediate and merciless. 5 mines closed almost at once. The population collapsed from around 28,000 to roughly 6,000 within a handful of years. Empty houses and boarded storefronts became the face of the place, and the families who stayed watched their neighbors vanish month after month. The remaining mines struggled on until 1996, and then shut for good. What rescued Elliott Lake from disappearing altogether was a strange and clever act of reinvention. The town bought up the hundreds of homes the mining companies had abandoned and began marketing itself as an affordable retirement destination, renting and selling cheaply to seniors from the crowded South. It half worked, and the town survives to this day on the strength of that gamble. The shadow of the mines never fully lifted. Radioactive tailings from the old operations were used decades ago as fill beneath some of the residential subdivisions, and testing has found homes with gamma radiation and radon gas well above the safe limits. In some cases, many times the maximum a person should ever absorb in a year. You can buy a house in this district for the price of a modest car, $12,000 or $15,000 for something that needs work, and the low price carries a warning most buyers never hear until the papers are signed. Number 3. The Timiskaming Gold Belt around Kirkland Lake. East of the Great Central Forests, along the border with Quebec, lies the country that gold built. Kirkland Lake sat directly on top of one of the richest gold fields in Canadian history, a strip of ground so productive that it earned the nickname the Mile of Gold. Around it, dozens of small settlements sprang up along the railway, each one certain of its future. Consider a place called Dane, a rail siding that grew to almost 600 residents in the early 1900s, complete with a schoolhouse, 2 hotels, a general store, and a post office where the whole community collected its mail and its gossip. When the nearby gold rush faded, the population fell to around 200 within a single year. The train station was dismantled in 1958, the school closed its doors, the last hotel shut, and the building was eventually reduced to a pile of rubble that was finally cleared away in 2007. Today, Dane is a handful of surviving houses at a highway junction, the kind of place you pass at 70 kilometers an hour without ever realizing it was once a town at all. The great open pit of the Adams Mine, 11 kilometers south of Kirkland Lake, closed in 1990, and afterward the only serious proposal anyone could find for the enormous hole in the ground was to fill it with garbage trucked 500 kilometers north from Toronto, a plan that would have made the region a dump for the very city its people had fled to. Across this belt, wood frame houses on generous lots sell for figures that would not cover a downtown parking spot, sometimes as little as $14,000, and the grass grows waist-high in yards where nobody has parked a car in a decade. The gold is not gone from the ground here, and mines still open and close with the price of the metal, but the towns learned long ago never to trust a boom again. Number 4. The Sudbury Basin and its abandoned satellites. Sudbury is the great survivor of the North, a raw nickel camp that clawed its way into a proper regional capital, with hospitals, a university, a medical school, and more than 300 lakes inside its own municipal boundaries. Yet ring the city and drive its back roads, and you find a graveyard of the smaller communities that once fed it. The Greater Sudbury region contains more than 120 abandoned settlements, the highest concentration of ghost communities anywhere in the province, almost every one of them born and then killed by the mining industry. Take Creighton, a company town that at its height held around 2,200 people, with its own schools, its own streets, and a tight community of miners and their families who thought they would raise their grandchildren there. When the company decided the cost of maintaining the town no longer made financial sense, the residents were relocated, the buildings were pulled down, and the site was surrendered to cellar holes and cracked foundations that the returning bush is slowly swallowing. Walk those grids of empty streets today, and the only thing that tells you a neighborhood ever stood here is the pattern of the pavement under the moss and the occasional lilac bush blooming out of nowhere, planted by a hand that has been gone for 40 years. Around the surviving villages of the basin, small houses trade for $18,000 to $25,000, and the melancholy of the place is not the dramatic ruins, but the ordinariness of them, the quiet evidence that an entire ordinary way of life simply packed its bags and drove south, leaving the lilacs to bloom for no one. Drive out past the last streetlight of the surviving villages and the pavement gives way to gravel, and the gravel to 2 ruts in the grass, and at the end of the ruts you will find a foundation, a set of concrete steps climbing to a door that no longer exists, and a rusted swing set half buried in the encroaching poplar. Children played here. A kettle boiled in a kitchen here on winter mornings. The rock that made the city rich took the towns as payment, and gave nothing back but the holes in the ground and the names on a few weathered signs. Subscribe to show that these videos actually matter and make a difference. Number 5. The northern clay belt around Cochrane and Kapuskasing. Here is the cruelest chapter of the whole story, because this emptiness was, in part, a deliberate mistake made in an office far to the south. Early in the 20th century, the government looked at a wide band of flat clay soil stretching across the north and decided it would become farmland, a brand new agricultural frontier to rival the wheat fields of the prairies. Settlers were encouraged to move north, a great many of them French-speaking families from Quebec, and they cleared the heavy bush by hand and built homesteads and raised villages along the rail lines, communities founded on the earnest vision of a francophone farming country north of Lake Nipissing. The problem was the growing season, and the problem could not be argued away. This far north the summers are short, and the killing frosts arrive early, and the clay, though flat and promising to the eye, was cold and heavy and prone to flooding. Wheat that flourished in Saskatchewan struggled and rotted in the muskeg-edged fields of the clay belt. The railway that had made a village bloom almost overnight in 1913 could not keep that village alive once the farms proved marginal and the harvests failed. The families drifted away to the mining towns and the pulp mills, or gave up on the north entirely. The Cochrane district, the second largest district in the province at more than 140,000 square kilometers, an area slightly smaller than the state of Michigan, held just under 78,000 people in the most recent census, a decline of more than 2% in only 5 years. Drive its side roads at dusk and you pass abandoned farmhouses tilting slowly into their own cellars, barns caved in under the weight of 30 winters of snow, and fields returning to alder and willow, where crops were once meant to feed a nation. The wind moves through the tall grass with a sound like water. Whole farmsteads change hands here for $10,000 to $16,000, the land and the house and the collapsing barn all together, and even at that price the buyers are painfully few. Number 6. The Kenora District and the Northwestern Boreal. In the far northwest, pressed against the borders of Manitoba, sits the largest single district in all of Ontario, a wilderness of more than 10,000 lakes and dense boreal forest where the entire population would barely fill a mid-sized hockey arena. The northernmost public road in the entire province, Highway 599, runs north from the Trans-Canada Highway and simply stops at Pickle Lake, roughly 540 kilometers north of Thunder Bay. Beyond the end of that pavement there is nothing but bush, water, and the fly-in communities that depend on aircraft in summer and ice roads in the depth of winter. The towns that do sit on the road were built on gold, on pulpwood, and on the railway, and a great many of them have been shrinking steadily for 2 full generations. The young leave for Thunder Bay or Winnipeg, or the oil work out west, and do not come back for anything but funerals. Schools consolidate and then close. The mill that once anchored a town runs a reduced shift, and then a rumor of closure, and then the closure itself. In the smaller settlements you can find a solid house sitting right on a lake, the kind of waterfront property that would sell for a fortune 2 provinces to the east, listed for the price of a used snowmobile, $20,000 or less. And it will sit on the market season after season because the nearest specialist doctor is hours away over a road that closes in a blizzard, and the winters here do not forgive a single mistake. Number 7. The Timmins Gold Camp and the Eastern Goldfields. West of the Clay Belt lies Timmins, one of the great gold camps of the 20th century, a place that pulled more gold from the ground than almost anywhere else in the country. The mines here did not close overnight in a single dramatic blow, which in a way made the decline harder to see. Timmins simply shrank, year after quiet year. The city's population slipped to under 42,000 at one recent count, a fall of more than 3% in 5 years, ranking it among the fastest shrinking communities in the whole of Canada. Mechanization did to Timmins what it did everywhere, replacing hundreds of workers with machines and a handful of technicians. Around the city, the smaller mining villages that once dotted the goldfields have thinned or vanished, their headframes rusting against the sky, their company houses sold off cheap or simply abandoned. A modest bungalow in one of the fading satellite settlements can be had for $13,000 or $14,000, and the buyer, if one ever comes, inherits a street where every second house is dark and the streetlights hum over cracked, empty sidewalks. The gold is still coming out of the ground in places, but a modern mine no longer builds a town around itself. It flies its workers in for 2 weeks and flies them out again, and the community that mining once created is a thing of the past. Which brings us to the paradox that sits at the very heart of this whole story. If the houses are truly this cheap, if a person can buy a home for the price of a second-hand car, why on earth does nobody move in? The answer is that the price on the listing was never the real cost of living in the north. Consider the winter, first of all. Across much of the region, the cold settles in for 5 long months, and the temperature drops routinely below -30 degrees, and in the far interior, it can sink toward -40, with a wind on top of that which strips the warmth from a body in minutes. Heating a house through that kind of season is not a comfort, it is a survival expense, and it can run into thousands of dollars every single winter, and if the furnace dies in the middle of January, there is no repair contractor waiting around the corner. Consider the isolation. The nearest hospital with an actual specialist might be a 2 or 3 hour drive over roads that glaze with ice and close outright in a storm. Schools have consolidated to the point where a child may spend an hour on a bus each way, assuming there is still a school within reach at all. Consider the services that have quietly disappeared, one after another, over the decades. The grocery store closed, the bank branch closed, the pharmacy closed. Ordering anything shipped to a remote northern postal code costs a steep premium, when a company will agree to ship there at all. Reliable internet, the one modern miracle that might let a person earn a good living from a cheap house in the bush, is thin, slow, or entirely absent across enormous stretches of the region, which is precisely why families with unreliable connections have kept leaving for towns closer to the highway. And beneath all of the practical arithmetic lies something far harder to put a number on: the psychological weight of choosing to live in a place that everyone else has already chosen to leave. There is a particular loneliness to a main street where half the windows are dark, to a hockey rink with no children skating in it, to a church that opens once a month for a congregation of 9 gray heads. Run the numbers on a cheap northern house, and the illusion of the bargain dissolves quickly. A $10,000 house that burns $3,000 or $4,000 of heating oil every winter, that sits an hour from the nearest doctor, that needs a new roof no local contractor will drive out to install, that loses its water line to the frost every second January, is not a cheap house at all. It is a slow, steady bill for the privilege of solitude. Add the cost of a reliable vehicle, capable of surviving the roads and the cold, because there is no transit and no walking to anything. Add the premium on every liter of fuel, and every bag of groceries hauled up from the south. Add the insurance company that raises its rates or refuses to cover a house so far from a fire hall. The house was the one part of the equation that was ever cheap. Everything else quietly costs more in the north than it does in the city the buyer was trying to escape. A house is cheap because the community that once gave it meaning has drained away down the highway, and no amount of money can buy that community back into being. So is there any future for this enormous, emptying land, or does the north simply keep hollowing out until the last light goes off? The honest answer is complicated, and it deserves an honest telling. For a brief and surprising window, roughly between 2021 and 2025, something genuinely remarkable happened. Several census districts that had been declining steadily for decades actually grew again. The growth was not born in the mines or the mills, which are long past creating towns. It came from newcomers. Programs such as the Rural and Northern Immigration Pilot were designed specifically to steer immigrants away from the overcrowded magnets of Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, and into northern communities crying out for workers. And for a few years, the strategy worked better than almost anyone expected. International students and temporary residents filled apartments in North Bay, in Timmins, in Sudbury. Remote work, thrown forward by the pandemic, allowed a small number of people to trade a cramped condo in the south for a lakeside house in the north at a fraction of the price. Retirees kept discovering Elliott Lake and the affordable towns strung around it. For the first time in a generation, the phones at some town halls were ringing with people asking how to move in rather than how to sell up and leave. Yet the recovery is fragile, and the people who study it closely refuse to sugarcoat what is happening underneath the encouraging headlines. In nearly every corner of the north, deaths now outnumber births, a condition the demographers call natural decrease, and it is a hard trend to reverse. The population is old and growing older, and the surge of the last few years rested almost entirely on immigration and temporary residence rather than on any renewal coming from within the communities themselves. Analysts warned in a recent briefing that without the newcomers of the past 5 years, almost every northern district would have shrunk instead of grown, and recent federal decisions to cut immigration and temporary resident numbers have taken an axe to the very thing that was keeping the region above water. The Ring of Fire, a vast deposit of critical minerals buried in the far north, is spoken of endlessly as a possible engine of revival, but it has been spoken of that way for well over a decade, while the roads and rail needed to reach it remain unbuilt, tangled in cost, in politics, and in unresolved obligations to the First Nations whose land it crosses. For the small settlements far from the highway, the ones with the $10,000 houses and the boarded stores, the pilot programs and the remote workers have changed almost nothing at all. The fragile new growth clings to the cities within a few hours of Toronto. The deep north keeps quietly draining, one estate sale and one closed school at a time. Some towns have refused to accept the verdict, and it is worth honoring their stubbornness. They dangle incentives at anyone willing to gamble on the north. Cheap building lots sold for a token dollar to families who promise to build and stay. Tax breaks, small grants, welcome committees that meet the newcomer's moving truck with a casserole and a list of who to call when the pipes freeze. A handful of the near-north communities, the ones within reach of a highway and a functioning hospital, have made these programs pay off, drawing young families priced out of the southern housing market who discover that a modest income stretches remarkably far when a house costs less than a used car. Elliott Lake still fills apartments with retirees. North Bay still draws people fleeing the cost of the city, but the incentives work only where the fundamentals already half work, where there is a job, a school, a doctor, and a road that stays open in February. Offer a free lot in a settlement 4 hours past the end of the pavement, with no clinic and no cell signal and a winter that lasts half the year, and the phone does not ring. The market has made its judgment, and no brochure has yet overturned it. The uncomfortable truth is that a place can be beautiful, and cheap, and steeped in history, and still lose the one thing it cannot manufacture, which is a reason for young people to build a future there. Drive the empty highways at the end of a long northern day, and you will feel the weight of it settle into your chest. The light stretches out long and gold across the muskeg, and the shadows of the black spruce reach all the way across the road. A grain elevator throws its silhouette 100 meters down an abandoned rail siding. A farmhouse stands alone at the edge of a field, with its curtains still hanging in the windows, waiting for a family that is never coming back through the door. This is a land that gave a young country its silver and its gold and its nickel, that built the wealth and the skylines of cities 1,000 kilometers to the south, and asked in return only that someone might remember it and choose to stay. The houses are cheap because memory, in the end, is cheap, and the wind is the only thing that still moves freely down most of these streets. Look after yourselves out there, wherever you are watching from, and spare a thought, tonight, for the north of Ontario, emptying quietly under a sky far too big for the few who remain.